Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Pocantico Center's 2020 Virtual Fall Forum. My name is Ellie Weisenberg-Kelly, and I'm the Manager of Public Programs at the Pocantico Center of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. The Pocantico Center is located in Tarrytown, New York, and is home to Kykuit, the historic Rockefeller estate overlooking the Hudson River and built in 1913 by John D. Rockefeller. Today, the Pocantico Center serves as a conference center and a community resource, offering public access as a museum, as well as offering a wide variety of arts and culture programming and an artist residency program. We're so happy to be able to reconnect with you since closing our doors due to the pandemic back in March, and we're excited to welcome new audiences through virtual programs like this evening's forum. I'd like to thank Judy Clark, Executive Director of the Pocantico Center, as well as my colleagues, Regina Cregan, Director of Conferences and Administration, Ari Klickstein, Communications Associate and Digital Specialist, and Katrina London, Manager of Collections and Curatorial Projects, for their help in making tonight's forum possible. Thank you also to Frank Ventura and Jess Ranistaj at Benchicom for their technical assistance. And also thank you to Yuka Yokoyama at Shofuso Japanese House and Garden for spearheading the collaboration between Pocantico and Shofuso, and for helping to bring this wonderful group of presenters together this evening. Tonight, we're pleased to present our fall forum, Modern Japanese Architecture and Design in America. Our distinguished panel of scholars and curators will be introduced in detail by tonight's moderator, Kim Andrews, Executive Director of the Japan American Society of Greater Philadelphia, which stewards Shofuso. We'll have time for a Q&A after the panelists wrap up their presentations, and we invite you to use the Q&A box to pose questions during tonight's discussion. If you have any technical issues or other questions not related to the forum, please feel free to pop those into the Q&A as well, and we'll respond to you. And we are recording tonight's forum, and we'll be posting it on YouTube soon. And now I'll hand things off to Kim Andrews, who will get the evening started. Thank you so much.
Hi, everybody. I've been Executive Director of Shofuso since 2010, and I merged us with the Japan American Society of Greater Philadelphia in 2016. So now JASGP administers Shofuso Japanese House and Garden, oversees the Philadelphia Cherry Blossom Festival, leads the U.S.-Japan Business and Public Policy Series, and directs additional Japanese art, business, and cultural programs. In 2020, we sought to elevate Japanese heritage sites in the Philadelphia region through our Japan Philly 2020 Year of Japan. Our Shofuso and Modernism mid-century collaboration between Japan and Philadelphia exhibition, the exhibition of which was just cut short by a few weeks by new restrictions in Philadelphia on Monday, was funded by the Pew Center for Arts and Heritage, and like this program, highlights the work of Junzo Yoshimura, George Nakashima, and Noémi and Antonin Raymond. Co-curators William Whitaker and JASGP's Yuka Yokoyama partnered with George Nakashima Woodworkers and the Raymond Center for Living Art and Design in New Hope for this exhibition and related programming, which you can see at shofusoandmodernism.com. Just a few words about Shofuso in West Philadelphia. Shofuso is the site of the first Japanese structure and garden in North America. It was built in Japan, exhibited in Manhattan at MoMA, and installed in West Philadelphia in 1957 and opened to the public in 1958. And it's been there for more than 60 years now. We connect Japan and Philadelphia and consider Shofuso to be the physical embodiment of friendship between Japan and Philadelphia. During my tenure at Shofuso, we've moved preservation of the historic house and landscape to an organizational priority, clearly defined not only in our preservation plan, but also in our recently completed 2021 to 2023 strategic plan. We use the U.S. Secretary of the Interior's standards for the treatment of historic properties for Shofuso's preservation standard and the National Park Service Technical Bulletin number 36, Protecting Cultural Landscapes, Planning, Treatment, and Management of Historic Landscapes by Charles Birnbaum for the preservation of our historic gardens. As a Japanese historic site, we often have to bring craftsmen from Japan to repair our roof and make other specialty carpentry repairs. Our Hinoki bark roof, the only one of its kind outside of Japan, cost $1.2 million to replace in 1999. So we raise $100,000 every 5 years to conduct roof maintenance and prolong the life of the roof itself. Our staff has studied and trained to conduct regular maintenance and preservation tasks like shoji screen paper replacement. And our garden, the third-ranked Japanese garden in North America, requires advanced training and skills that are gained by research, training at the Portland Japanese Garden, training in Japan, participating as a founding member of the North American Japanese Garden Association, and consulting with experts and our peers at Japanese gardens in the US and Japan. Even in Japan, the maintenance of traditional or historic structures is challenged by high costs and decreasing numbers of craftsmen, so you can imagine the challenges are even greater outside of Japan. Luckily, we'll hear more about this in our program today about the intersections of Japanese garden design and the Japanese and American craft movements, as well as their shared experiences of preserving Japanese structures and landscapes at Pocantico, Japan Society's New York headquarters, and Shofuso in Philadelphia. Now I'd like to say a few words about our speakers tonight. Our first speaker, William Whitaker, is curator of the Architectural Archives at the University of Pennsylvania Stuart Weitzman School of Design. He is co-author of The Houses of Louis I. Kahn and recipient of the 2014 Literary Award of the Athenaeum of Philadelphia. Trained as an architect at Penn and the University of New Mexico, Whitaker works most closely with the archival collections of Louis I. Kahn, Lawrence Halprin, and the partnership of Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown in support of teaching, scholarship, preservation, and public engagement. He is guest curator for the Shofuso and Modernism exhibition that just closed for the season. Our second speaker will be Yukie Kamiya, the gallery director of the Japan Society, New York since 2015. Formerly, Kamiya was chief curator of Hiroshima City Museum of Contemporary Art and associate curator of the New Museum in New York. Kamiya has curated numbers of exhibitions internationally and co-curated ProRegress, the 12th Shanghai Biennial in China in 2018 and 19. She also served as guest curator for cultural institutions, including the Japan Foundation and Goethe Institute, and curated group exhibitions, including in Seoul, Hiroshima, Taipei, and Beijing. Yukie studied art history at Waseda University in Tokyo, where she was visiting professor at the university from 2008 to 2013. Our final speaker, Cynthia Altman, is an independent scholar who, from 1992 to 2018, served as curator at Kykuit for the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, and prior to that, for the Rockefeller family. Her publications and lectures have delved into the history of the collections, gardens, and architecture. She continues as curatorial advisor for the Rockefeller University. A graduate of Middlebury College, she received an MA in art history from Columbia University, specializing in Asian art. So you all know we'll take questions for the speakers in the Zoom question and answer box, which is at the bottom of your screens. And then I will read those questions to our panelists in the Q&A session after the presentations. So please put your questions in there and we will try to work all the way through them. Now, I would like to introduce and welcome William Whitaker, to speak about Junzo Yoshimura and his architecture. Bill? You are muted, Bill.
Sorry, guys. So it's a great pleasure to be here tonight and to recognize the shared heritage and architecture between Shofuso, between Kykuit and the Japan Society in New York. Tonight, we're going to foreground the architect, Junzo Yoshimura, who left a remarkable legacy here in the United States. Of course, he's got a really important legacy in Japan as well. But to recognize that this legacy has remained largely invisible in the United States. And so this event allows us an opportunity to begin to rewrite that story and to recognize that Junzo is somebody who we should know more about. And perhaps the collaboration between these organizations is something that we can work towards advancing that cause together. So I'm speaking to you from the Architectural Archives at the University of Pennsylvania. This is our reading room. And I thought, rather than doing a PowerPoint tonight, that I would tell you something of Junzo's story using objects from the collection. Just as a little break, I've made it my effort to try to break down some of the barriers imposed by Zoom, and taking you a little closer into the stories that objects tell, I think, is important. And so who is Junzo Yoshimura? So to give you a sense of that, I want to read a passage from George Nakashima's 1981 autobiography, Soul of a Tree, really a beautiful book in which he describes his friend Junzo. Junzo, one of the architects in the office, he's speaking about the office of Antonin and Noémi Raymond, and I became quite friendly. He taught me many of the wonderful traditional customs of Japan. Together, we would read ancient classical literature, such as the 10-foot square hut or the Hojoki, the musings of a priest in the beautiful language of the 12th century. In the early spring, we would go off to the mountains to see the plum blossoms, barely visible through the falling snow. In warmer weather, we would visit his family's handsome house on the seashore at Hayama. Lying on our backs in the delicately made tea house there, we would empathize with the beautiful graining of the carefully selected cedar boards that had been used for the ceiling. We traveled a good deal. We took trips to Kyoto, the ancient capital, to enjoy the shrines and temples, fabulously built wooden structures expressing the beauty and eternal quality of the island people of Japan, and the deep reverence these people have for nature, the sweet sadness of never breaking the bonds of nirvana. We also traveled to Nara, where I found more architectural expressions of the innate spirit of the Japanese, and to Hakone to rest our bodies and our spirits in the relaxing hot springs. In Issei, once again, in the appreciation of its grand shrines, we expanded the indwelling of the Japanese spirit. He ended with, I owe so much to Junzo and his deep understanding of the Japanese psyche and culture. He felt too, my yearning to understand it, and took me in hand. He knew so well the elegance and power of simplicity, the beauty of proper materials in building, the delicacy of unfinished wood, the traditional and modern creative proportions, where the error of a fraction of an inch can make the design fail absolutely. He knew these things well in both the time-honored Japanese design and in the free modern concepts, and he passed them on to me. So here's Junzo, and this is a photograph taken in about 1934 in Katorizawa, Japan. He's sitting at the Raymond's summer studio in Katorizawa. So speaking of the Raymonds, I'm gonna switch to a camera here and show you a book that the Raymonds did of their work in Japan. And up front, we can see there's a wonderful picture of the office. And here we have Junzo, Antonin Raymond, and George Nakashima. It's important to note that missing from the shot is Noémi Raymond, who really is a critical figure, someone who, as well, in terms of American architecture, has been a little bit lost to history. She was a critical part of the office and very close to Junzo. That idea of Junzo taking George Nakashima close in hand, I think the Raymonds regarded Junzo in very much the same way. Somebody who they learned probably as much from as he did from them, and they relied on him very much. But let me give you a little sense of what the Raymonds' work looked like in Japan. And here is the Kitsuke Akaboshi house in Tokyo from 1932. Interesting in part because it's an example of Yoshimura's work, you know, as a project architect. Now he's working for the Raymonds. And this is typical of some of the houses that the Raymonds were doing in a very modern style in Tokyo. Noémi Raymond was responsible for much of the interior design work. But it's in a room like this where you see the coming together of the modern world and the Japanese traditions of living on the floor, the furniture in the tansu chests, but also the modern furniture in tubular metal, rugs with a floor you walk on in shoes versus the tatami mat that you live in. And just one more example, a fun house in Katorizawa, another one where Yoshimura is in charge, where thatch is not used for its associations or romantic associations. It's a good summer insulator against the heat. And again, you can see a combination, this idea of living in two worlds. Mrs. Kodera in the tatami room, and then beyond a dining table and even a fireplace, which would be unusual. Okay, so Yoshimura worked for the Raymonds from when he was in college in 1928. And in 1940, he had the opportunity to go to the United States. The Raymonds had traveled to New Hope in 1938 and purchased a 150-acre farm in the outskirts of Philadelphia in New Hope and renovated it. And this is the Raymond Farm, and it's now the Raymond Farm Center for Living Arts and Design. And it really is one of the most extraordinary sites in American modernism. The combination of the experience of having lived and worked in Japan for 18 years, coming together with a reverence for early American architecture, particularly in this case, Quaker farmhouses, resonated with the Raymonds. There were important lessons there, and they had learned important lessons from the traditional farm buildings of rural Japan, the Minka farmhouses in particular. And so we're seeing here a photograph from 1940, around the time Yoshimura would have arrived. One thing I want to show you is the close connection between inside and outside in the Raymond Farm, really dramatically opening up its interior to the larger world became very important. And it's one of the essential lessons of traditional Japanese architecture into modernism. You can see the shoji screens are a more overt reference to that. Here's Junzo dining at the farm. And then if you allow me to put this into a slide, you can see that there's actually, this is a photograph taken in 1940. It was actually a farm with dairy cows and so on that allowed the Raymonds to be closer to the land, to live close to the land, and to enjoy that agrarian idea. What got Junzo to Philadelphia, to the US in particular, was a commission to do a little tea house for the Japan Institute in New York. And here are two photographs in the Sugiyama collection showing the structure in Kyoto where it was being fabricated before being shipped over to the United States. So it was installed in Rockefeller Center. And this is the first example. And this is actually something the Raymonds allowed Junzo to design. Noémi was the primary interface with him, designing interiors for the Japan Institute in Rockefeller Center. And so it was removed in 1942, but it did survive. And I'm actually showing you a printout from the Brooklyn Museum. This is that tea house as it was installed in a 1952 exhibition of Japanese folk art done by Yanagi. Although sadly, I think we've discovered it's no longer at the Brooklyn Museum. So there were other projects Yoshimura got to work on. Again, this is with the Raymonds. This is the Briggs Carrera house out in Montauk Point. You can see this design incorporating elements like amado and sliding windows. But in the primary living space, you can see the close connection between inside and out. And then even a platform, which we might call a deck, but it could also have connections to things like moon viewing platforms if you consider the experience of Katsura. So one of the objects that's very special here is this little book that Junzo made as he was departing from the Raymond Farm. And he stayed there for about 11 months. And you can see this is scenes from Raymond territory. And the wonderful first image is a little shelf in the entrance area, and that it's a pair of work gloves. So opening it up, you can see Junzo exploring some of the buildings in the area en route to the farm, an old mill building, old farm buildings that he's captioning reminders of yesterday, a neighboring house, the fine old stonework of New Hope. A photograph of the southern part of the house as a bit of Japan is seen in the eaves, he writes. And then these last three images, an impressive view, he writes, the corner of the dining room with the Raymond son, Claude, and then to the rear of the house, the magnificent barn. So Junzo had to leave very quickly. And so I just want to read a little bit. These are the letters that were sent back to the office in Tokyo and survived. And this is Noémi Raymond writing back to Sugiyama-san and letting him know that Junzo will be leaving and that times have become very serious. And that her husband recommends that he close the office immediately and that he should set up his own office. You are a very good architect and you should go out and find some kind of job, no matter which, becoming that way active and useful. It does not matter at this time what the artistic merits may be. Art has ceased to exist everywhere. We ourselves have been busy with ugly defense housing, as Junzo will tell you, and we have no prospects for anything better for a long time. So Mr. Raymond says, put away your pride and your hopes for the present and do anything. There must be things to do, and you must connect yourself with the young, new activities of your country. So we actually also surviving, and this is from the Raymonds, is Junzo's letter from San Francisco aboard the ship. This is the last ship to have left for Japan. And many things are going through my mind now like a dream. And every image ends at peaceful life of new hope. So this idea of having had this experience in the United States and having taken away that experience of living and working in the United States, of course, brings us back, and I'm going to end shortly, to the opportunity to do Shofuso for the Museum of Modern Art in New York. The Raymonds had a small hand in connecting Yoshimura with the curators at MoMA, you know, as a great act of mentorship. So in the August 23rd issue of Life magazine is a beautiful little profile. Art, Japanese house is a hit in New York. And these are so much fun to look at these old magazines. Of course, you get the novelty of seeing this thing built on 54th Street in New York and how extraordinary the view of this must have been to New Yorkers, to the larger country. Of course, there's a Mercury ad next door. But I think my favorite image, besides just this spread with the advertising, is this image of Junzo bringing those experiences back in this case, in the form of 736 crates. These are the contents that will then be used to create Shofuso. So I think Yoshimura is really an exceptional figure, and in connecting the art and architecture and traditions within the United States. And 10 minutes is an impossibly short amount of time to be able to open that up, but I hope you've enjoyed this little show and tell from Philadelphia. Thank you.
Oh, Bill, thank you so much. I loved seeing those objects. That was amazing. I love archives. Now I would like to introduce Yukie Kamiya, speaking about the Japan Society's Yoshimura building in Manhattan and its preservation. Yukie?
Yeah, thank you, Kim, for introducing me. And thank you very much, Bill. It's great to see the precious material. But I'm embarrassed to say, but I'm going back to the regular Zoom presentation, but hope you can enjoy some of the story. Yeah. So thank you for the all the staff of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund for organizing this great Afro Forum. I'm Yukie Kamiya, Japan Society Gallery Director. Japan Society will celebrate the 50th anniversary for our home building next year in 2021. So today I'd like to introduce the 50-year journey of practice at Japan Society as an active site of culture exchange and how we inspired by the Junzo Yoshimura and Japanese modern architecture and design. So Japan Society, founded in 1907, over a century ago, a cultural institution for foster the United States and Japan friendship and understanding. Our headquarters building earlier called Japan House, built in 1971 on the East 47th Street in Manhattan, which is around the corner of the United Nations. The land is donated by John D. Rockefeller III, who had been the president of Japan Society since 1952. John D. Rockefeller III and Yoshimura had a long friendship. In 1951, John D. Rockefeller III traveled to Japan to accompany with the last peace mission and negotiate the final peace treaty. It's before the independence of Japan. He and his wife, Blanchett Rockefeller, met Yoshimura at this time for the first time, and they invite him to design a Japanese style house for Museum Modern Art, which just Bill showed it. And now it's, as you know, the Shofuso and in Philadelphia. After 2 decades friendship since the first meeting, Japan Society building was born. Yoshimura's earlier American project followed the Japanese tradition, but for Japan Society building, he rather took the contemporary approach, interpreting Japan's architecture heritage in industrial material. You can see it still is like that. Japanese architecture traditions such as the angled rail at the entrance type, it's a modern style of the kagoyose. It's kind of protection from the horses and the people. And like a metal sunscreen, a contemporary version of the traditional koshi grids. Yoshimura explained, people built their house with local and traditional material. Today, however, contemporary buildings all over the world use the same basic material, concrete, steel, and glasses. In designing Japan House, I have tried to express in contemporary architecture the spirit of Japan. Yoshimura was a pioneer to design the permanent culture institution as star architect. The building design represents the mission and philosophy of the institution. He represents a subtle blend of Japanese tradition and international modern design, and the society serves as a venue for culture exchange. And later, you can see a variety of examples in following decades. Japanese architect designed American Museum, started like Ereimoka by Arata Isozaki, and the Modern Art Museum in Fort Worth by Tadao Ando, 2004 edition, and the addition of the MoMA New York, which already new addition there, but 2007 New Museum Contemporary Art as well by Sana. So now let's, not only the facade, let's go into the building of the Japan Society. At the entrance hall, you can see garden and pond. And actually the second floor, there is another Japanese style garden. And there is a Yoshimura designed stone water basin. In Manhattan, with a limited land, he couldn't design outdoor garden. However, his plan include gardens inside the building. You can back to precede the original drawing by Yoshimura. It's slightly different from the final plan, but more clearly we can see and learn the vision of Yoshimura. It's outside and inside it's connected. And in the plan, you can see many water and garden. So to realize Japan Society building, we can find another long friendship with Yoshimura. He was great woodworker, George Nakashima. As you can see, it's great to see this architect in suits. And Yoshimura trained as architecture department of the Tokyo Art College, and now also called Tokyo Geijutsu Daigaku. As a student, he already associated with architect Antonin Raymond. And then Yoshimura joined Raymond Tokyo office, followed graduation in 1931. Nakashima started working at Raymond office Tokyo since 1934, so they worked together. Yoshimura was a key person for Raymond, Noémi, and Nakashima, and let them know about Japanese traditional architecture and culture. They are the colleague to see traditional craftsmanship through the lens of modernism. Although Nakashima started as his career as an architect, since 1940s, he started to fabricate furniture, which he can control from the beginning to the end. So this is especially the beautiful design drawing commissioned for Japan Society. And the meeting room and also the entrance. And there is also the present office room. It's a beautiful designed Nakashima furniture you can see as the architecture fixture of this building. And Yoshimura wrote, I hope the Japan House will play its full role in promoting understanding between the United States and Japan. In 1971, May, when the building was still under construction, Japan Society already started the program. Look at this. This is Issey Miyake's, the first New York fashion show, the autumn fall season at Japan Society. We cannot identify where, but it seems like the second floor gallery. You can see the ceiling is going to be the same. And Japan Society Gallery became a central site to introduce a variety of Japanese art and culture, including antiquity. The inaugural exhibition was Rinpa, the 17th century decoration style. This is a Shinto exhibition, Horyuji Temple Treasure, and the others. It became a platform to connect past, history, and present. Japan Society expanded the numbers of ambitious programs and events, not only visual art. We organize a corporate program, performing arts, film, education program, and the staff expanded. Then society decided the major innovation twice to meet challenge in the future in the 1990s. First one is 92 and the second one is 96. Almost 10,000 square feet on floor space we added and our gallery expanded double. And in Yoshimura's words, there is a sentences. We have to create contemporary architecture more and more. Cannot stay in nostalgia. Human beings always appreciate new inspiration and new development. With his words, we took another journey for challenges. I want to introduce the example, what we can do after that. 2005, using a modernism style facade as a large canvas, we installed a large banner project for Little Boy, exhibition curated by Takashi Murakami. And also often we invite next generation of architects for exhibition design. Made in Tokyo is the exhibition curated by and designed by Atelier Bawal, Tokyo-based architect firm, and explore the megacity Tokyo and the lifestyle transition. Another recent example was Bolo Textile, Sustainable Aesthetic. It's designed by Soil, Brooklyn-based architect Jindu and Florian Ehrenberg. They started their career worked with Sana, so inspired by many Japanese architect works. Always the architect next generation changed the space and atmosphere dramatically, and we enjoy the different physical experience. But not only artists also take the architecture challenges. In 2017, artist Hiroshi Sugimoto renovated our famous interior garden with its minimal touch. Sugimoto replaced some stones which was originally located at the Yoshimura designed garden, and the new stone garden emerged from the dialogue with the building. Then we launched an annual sculpture project inviting artists to install sculpture with bonsai, waterfall. Sculpture create a new face of Japan society and welcome all the audience. This is the next year as we invite Yoshitomo Nara and his sculpture, Miss Forest, and ceramics is installed. Yoshimura says, design should be simple and clear. Architecture should dedicate it for people's living and the spiritual richness first. This is a brief introduction, but a rich history of Japan's society. And our challenge will continue with Yoshimura's spirit and craftsmanship. Thank you very much for hearing.
Yukie, thank you so much. That was really wonderful. I love the Japan Society building. Now, I want to remind everybody, feel free to ask questions in the Q&A box at the bottom, and I will read them to the panelists after the final presentation. Now I'd like to introduce Cynthia Altman speaking about Junzo Yoshimura's structures at the Pocantico Center and Nakashima's designs for the Japanese house private residence. Cynthia?
Oh, thank you to both Bill and Yukie for wonderful presentations. I learned so much from both of you, but I'm looking forward to traveling with you all through two iconic structures designed by Yoshimura that are for Pocantico. One, a traditional tea house, which I hope many of you have visited, and one, a modern residence, both heralding a classic elegance, a simplicity and purity of materials. The tea house was first envisioned in 1960. That's a little less than a decade after the house was, the Shofuso was built in the garden at MoMA. And the Japanese house was commissioned in 1974 by Nelson Rockefeller. In these two structures, I'd like to look closely at the traditional elements of pre-modern Japanese architecture that become important to the modernist canon. The flexibility of plan, the close relation of the indoor and outdoor, as Bill already spoke about it in the Raymond's work, and the reverence, the use and reverence for natural materials. Next. The gardens at Kykuit had a Japanese garden and tea house, both built in 1908. The garden first as a practical solution to a marshy area. Japanese gardens were not unusual for the early 20th century. And then Kykuit's tea house and garden are credited. Next, please, to two craftsmen from Japan, Ueda and Takahashi, who had trained at the Imperial Palace, according to William Wells Bosworth, who was the architect who designed the main gardens up the hill at Kykuit. Next. The tea house today is called the Shrine, only to distinguish it from Yoshimura's tea house. You can see it has a typical hipped roof. And then the floor plan, you can see there are two rooms, one an 8-mat room, 8 tatami mat room, and one a 6-mat tatami room. Next, please. The three outer walls are shoji screens to the outside, sliding screens to the outside, and they're separated by sliding fusuma panels with paintings of birds and flowers and landscapes by an early 20th century Nihonga painter. There's a surrounding veranda, which is a characteristic we'll see in the other buildings as well. And along the south wall of each of the rooms are the staggered shelves and the tokonoma, or the space used to display a hanging scroll or a flower arrangement. Next, please. The tea house and garden changed little during the first half of the 20th century, but in 1960, after the death of John D. Rockefeller Jr., the mahogany tea house was moved southwest about 150 meters to this grove of white pine oriented to face the large sycamore. As Yukie has already mentioned, it was Mr. and Mrs. John D. Rockefeller III who had very close ties to Japan. They were serious collectors of Asian art, and in addition to revitalizing Japan Society, they founded Asia Society in 1956. And it's their collection that forms the core of the Asia Society's collection today. So, and Mrs. John III, as has already been mentioned, helped to convince MoMA to work with Yoshimura, who she'd met through the Raymonds on the exhibition house at MoMA. But now, next please. November 14th, 1960, she wrote to Yoshimura that the Rockefeller family was interested in redoing the garden more authentically and would like to replace the 1908 tea house with, quote, a very simple and beautiful garden pavilion of the classical style along the order of the Katsura Villa. Next, please. So David Engel designed the 2-acre garden, elaborating and expanding upon earlier plantings. And the earlier plantings had been much more open to the surrounding lawns. The house was built in Japan and shipped over and erected on site in the winter of 1962-63. Next, please. These photos from the Archive Center document the construction on site and the craftsmen from Nakamura Komuten who were on site to build it. Next, please. That's Mr. Nakamura Sotoji on the right. And down in the lower left corner is a photograph of George Shimamoto, who was the American architect on site. He also was on site for the building of the Japanese house 10 years later. The ridge, next please. Some more wonderful photos of the craftsmen at work on site. Next, please. The ridgepole ceremony was held on December 8th, 1962, and Shinto, Buddhist, and Christian prayers were said for the protection of the house from all the elements and for the prosperity and safety of the engineers, architects, and owners. Next, please. The tea house is larger than a traditional tea house. The entry is on the south side, which is quite typical. And as we saw in the shrine, there's a veranda. Let's see, I didn't, across the western, this is oriented north-south. So across the western side of the house and along the back as well. There are 2 rooms, a 12-mat tatami and a 6-mat tatami. Next, please. The main room overlooks a pond and the mountains. Next, please. And the mountains across the Hudson, you can see. The shoji open out to the east as well. Next, please. To an enclosed garden and stream. Next, please. The north wall of the main room has the staggered shelves that are quite typical of this type of architecture, and a traditional writing desk or shoin, and also the tokonomo, a space for hanging a scroll and having a flower arrangement. There's also a small Western style kitchen and a traditional cedar soaking tub in the bath. Next, please. Today, the Tea House and Garden welcome visitors for tours and tea ceremony demonstrations, limited because the tea house is rather small and the garden is quite fragile. Next, please. The garden, as it expanded, includes passages that illustrate tenets from Japanese garden design, such as borrowed scenery on the right. Those 2 conical piles of gravel are echoed in the hedge behind, and that's meant to carry your eye out to the rolling lawns and even to the Hudson and the mountains beyond. Shake is the name of the term. And also on the left is a garden obviously based on Ryoanji, the iconic garden at Daitokuji in Kyoto. Next, please. Over recent years, several restoration, I'm sorry, I do have a few garden photos for you. I hope you'll be able to come see us in the spring or see the garden in the spring. Next, please. Next. One more, okay. Over recent years, there have been several restoration projects, some in collaboration with the Shofuso. Thank you very much. The craftsmen would go first to Philadelphia and then tag on a few extra days coming up to Kykuit. So 11 layers of hinoki bark are used for for these gates, not nearly as huge a project as the Shofuso's bark roof. Next, and also renewing the tatami, and the arrow on the left points, and then the next one as well, and the shoji the following year. And these are just meant to show you the curious juxtaposition of the traditional Japanese craftsmen working amidst the stalls in the 19th century carriages in Kykuit's coach barn. The work was all done on site. Next, excuse me, next please. About a decade later, in 1974, Nelson Rockefeller called on Yoshimura to design a home for his family, intended to simplify his life. After nearly 2 decades at Kykuit, the home built for his grandfather in 1913 and requiring the attention of a large staff, and after decades in the public arena as well, the Japanese house was built to be a retreat. It was a project he took on with enthusiasm, for Nelson Rockefeller had once considered becoming an architect himself, but chose a different path. Next, please. It was planned for a steep slope opening out onto views of the Hudson and the mountains beyond. Next, please. Construction photos record an early site visit of Yoshimura, meeting with the governor on the right, and on the left with George Shimamoto, who we saw before. David Engel is to Yoshimura's right, and then to the left, I think, is the contractor, Walter Stanley. Next, please. And later in the process, this was the 1st of January, 1974, was a dedication, and the house is not quite finished, but there was a dedication in any case. So now, as we go through the house, I'd like you to consider the elements derived from traditional pre-modern Japanese architecture interpreted for a modern structure, and how they contribute to the serenity, simplicity, and classical elegance of the spaces. Great variety of natural materials. Next, please. Rough cut stone walls, floors of black slate, many woods chosen for the floors, the paneling and the ceilings, that red pine, camphor, oak and cedar, walnut and teak. Notice also the quality of light as is sifted through the shoji and reflected off the walls, which are painted white as we move upstairs. Next, please. The entry faces to the south, a level below the main floor. The floor is black slate and continues out on the same level to the Pilatus, which opens to the west. We saw in an earlier photo, incorporating distant natural elements into the space and ingeniously creating a continuity with the intimate interior garden with the waterfall that you see at the back of the slide here. That connects the upper courtyard garden to the lower level with the steps that come down, but also a waterfall. Next, please. An open stair takes you up to the main floor, where rooms are comfortably proportioned, and shoji screens and sliding fusuma panels partition the various rooms, creating an ultimate flexibility of space and disappear as they slide into their adjoining walls. They create a sense of unity and bring inside the natural environment from the courtyard garden and the westward view overlooking the distant landscape. Next, please. The courtyard garden is the center of a concise square ring plan, perhaps influenced by Antonin Raymond, who incorporated the outside into his designs very often. Yoshiaki Nakamura, the second generation of the family that built each of the houses, suggests instead another source, that perhaps this design was derived from Yoshimura's 1968 unrealized plan for the Imperial Palace in Tokyo, differing of course in scale. The plan is almost a precise square, and the path flow of the movement established at the top of the stairs is clockwise. Medieval Japanese architecture, the square pattern was typical for palace and residential architecture, as was the clockwise flow or path. And changes came with the development of tea house architecture, or skiya, as in the Shofuso in Philadelphia. And the pattern of movement then changed to be counterclockwise as well. Next, please. This is another view of the center garden, and this creates an atrium corridor, which is wonderful for the display of screens and scrolls and shelves displaying treasures of ceramics and lacquer. Next, please. This is just a rough sketch of the square ring plan. Again, the orientation is north, south. In the center, you can see the garden and the veranda, which encircles the western and southern sections of this level. Next, please. From the living room are open views to the Hudson, floor and ceiling windows. Again, you can see here the traditional veranda, which we saw both in the shrine and the Japanese tea house. And in the corner, if the pointer could point to the left, there is the tokonomo, an interpretation of the tokonomo with the hanging scroll in the raised platform and a place for a flower arrangement to bring the natural world inside. But most exciting, of course, are the furnishings. Yoshimura invited his colleague and friend George Nakashima to join him in the project, and the combined visions of these two masters create a serenity and a clear harmony. Yoshimura's great variety of materials is echoed in the many rare and exotic woods that Nakashima selected. East Indian laurel, English oak, burl, Persian walnut, English walnut, French olive ash burl. More than 200 pieces of furniture were designed and created in his New Hope studio. Many new designs for this project. So in front of the windows, the pointer again could show the low coffee table. This is called the Green Rock coffee table. It's a 2.5-inch slab of walnut, has much of a lightness in appearance, even though it's quite hefty, of course. And in front of it are two stools, are called the Green Rock ottomans. Green Rock is the local, is the on-site company that takes care of the property. So it's actually, they are named for the project. And then just to the left in the center of the photograph is a floor lamp, the Asanoha floor lamp, or literally hemp leaf decorative pattern, which is used in many facets of Japanese design in fabrics, papers, lacquer, a very complicated joinery and one of Nakashima's favorite. I have a better detail in a minute. And then in the right corner of the photo, it's a little hard to see, but there's quite a beautiful coffee table called the Migurin 2 coffee table. And then to the left of the sofa is a Migurin 1 end table and the conoid cushion chair as well. These are all special designs for the house. Migurin means, the translation is People's Tool Guild, and it's an association of designer craftsmen that was founded by sculptor Masayuki Nagara to keep alive the ancient craft traditions by adapting them to modern use. So, and Nakashima was admitted into the guild in 1969. Okay, next please. There's some better details of some of the furnishings. Next, please. And some drawings. Next, please. Okay, the dining room is to the left at the top of the stairs on the south side of the house, again with floor to ceiling windows and shoji create a diffuse and elegant light. The dining table is 2 book matched East Indian laurel matching planks of wood joined by butterfly keys. And it's surrounded by 10 conoid chairs of walnut, chairs that have just 2 legs. Next, please. There's some other images of the dining room and especially of the chairs. And next, please. But perhaps the official opening of the house, the Japanese house, would have been October 5th, 1975, the visit of Emperor Hirohito and Empress Nagako Kuni. And next, this is just Nelson Rockefeller taking matters into his own hands and photographing the Empress as she signs the guest book. So I'd like to just, next please, end with a quote from George Nakashima's book, Soul of a Tree, A Woodworker's Reflection. It was published in 1981. The deep, rich movements which produced the Diplan vase, the Doric column, Chartres Cathedral, the Katsura detached palace, were all significant in their youthful vigor and simple creativity. May we return to that spirit. It is not man's prerogative to destroy himself. We can only believe in the warm golden light in the darkness. So it's a message for today.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. That was wonderful. And thank you again to Bill and Yukie. We'll now take some time to answer audience questions. If you have any questions for our speakers, please post them in the Q&A box down below, and I'll read them aloud to the presenters. We have a couple there right now. So everybody, Bill, Yukie, could you please unmute yourselves, because I'm going to be hitting you with some questions. The first question is, did George Nakashima purchase the property in New Hope where the Nakashima venue is now located from the Raymonds? So did George Nakashima purchase that property from the Raymonds?
The answer is no. He bought it from a Quaker farmer that lived in that area along Aquitaine Road, but the property is almost adjoining the Raymond farm. So they actually live quite close to each other.
Thank you. Frank Lloyd Wright was greatly influenced by Japanese architecture and design. Cynthia, did he ever visit Pocantico?
Frank Lloyd Wright, I can't say definitively. I never heard of him visiting Pocantico. When did Wright pass away? Does anybody know?
1959.
1959. So I would think not. Because the previous generation was still living then, yeah.
Okay. And actually for you, Cynthia, is the Japanese house being used now at Pocantico?
Yes, it's a private residence now. Yes, it still is. Yeah.
Okay. Let's see. So for Bill, is there any connection between these interlocking commissions and the installation of the Japanese house at the Philadelphia Museum of Art?
Well, I know the installation of the Japanese house at the PMA is around the same time that Shofuso comes to Philadelphia. I would say, in some ways, that's against the context of rebuilding the connections between the Japanese and the American people after the white hot years of World War II, and that there were many people who were connected to culture. The Rockefellers are an example that were, investing in rebuilding those ties in the settings of museums. So I think it's not a surprise that the PMA has, its Japanese tea house it's installed, I think, in about 1955, 56, if I'm not mistaken. But I'm not an expert on that, sorry.
All right, thanks, Bill. For Yukie, 2 questions. And the first is, did Junzo Yoshimura travel to New York to see the renovations to the Japan Society building before his death?
Yeah, he saw it, but he not involved in directly for the renovation. Yeah, so different firm worked on that.
Okay, and is the Japan Society building listed in the National Register of Historic Places?
Yeah, it actually 2011. It was a historical culture site of the New York State newest building. We are listed. It's true.
Okay, that's awesome. And a couple questions for you, Cynthia, about the Japanese house. So it's a private residence. Is the family still residing in it? Is it or is it closed up and used for administrative purposes?
No, it's a residence. It's it's still within the family, and it's being used as a residence.
Okay, thank you. And another question, what kind of wood is the dining room and table chairs made of? Specific.
The dining room is the table is East Indian laurel, and the chairs are walnut.
And another question, which actually I can probably answer too. Cynthia, how do you heat the tea house in the winter? Do you use the traditional hibachi or electric gas heating?
The tea house is not heated in the winter.
That's the same thing for Shofuso.
It's not very accessible in the winter. For any of you who've been there, you know, the access from the road is a long path of stepping stones. So no one really goes there in the winter. Kykuit's open May through October. So it's that period of time when there are tea ceremony demonstrations or tours of the garden. Otherwise, it's not open. It's cared for, and as is the garden, but it's not really open to the public.
And
How about the Shofuso in the winter?
in the winter, well, now we're closed. We normally close between December and March. We reopen March for the same reason. It's extremely cold, and visitors could make their way through it for an hour or so and enjoy the garden. But it's staff that we worry about. I don't want my poor staff standing outside for 8 hours in the bitter cold in Philadelphia winter. Who in the Rockefeller family was first to be inspired by Japanese design and connected to Japan?
Well, Abby was a collector. Abby Aldrich Rockefeller grew up in Providence, and so that was close to Boston. So there are letters indicating she attended lectures, etc., and even hosted a lecture on Japanese prints, I think. And she was a collector of Japanese textiles, ceramics, prints, screens, and scrolls. She had a room in their main home that was called the Buddha room that had sculpture, Japanese sculpture in it. So yeah, I think she would have been the first. The previous generation was not interested in Japan that I've ever heard about. Yeah.
And there's a question, how did Shofuso House come to Philadelphia? Which I will take the liberty of answering. Shofuso had been built to be part of the House in the Museum Garden exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art, and then it was disassembled and put into storage. Meanwhile, in Philadelphia, we had the first Japanese garden in North America was at our site in 1876. So there had been a house and a garden in 1876, and then around the turn of the century, another house and garden were installed at Shofuso's site. And in 1955, during a renovation, there was a temple gate, and it caught fire and burned down. So we had a Japanese, a site that was historically Japanese, and we did not have a structure anymore. So some Philadelphia influential people spoke to the Rockefellers and helped bring Shofuso to Philadelphia. So it was installed in 57 and opened in 58 to the public, and it's been there ever since.
I've recently seen the name of J. Richardson Dilworth, who I think was a mayor at that time. He also ended up in the Rockefeller family office in the 60s and 70s. So maybe that was the influential bird who put the idea in there. I don't know. That's a guess.
There is a question in the chat. Weren't the Rockefellers involved in extraction and other industries in Japan and China in the 1920s? So that goes to to oil and manufacturing. Cynthia?
The Standard Oil was in China. I don't think they were in Japan. The Rockefellers, Jr. and Abby Aldrich Rockefeller took one trip to Asia, a 4-month or 3-month trip for the dedication of the Peking Union Medical College in 1921. And they spent a month of that time in Japan. I don't know. I see there's something about Mahjong. I never heard that before. The Rockefellers were responsible for bringing Mahjong. Maybe that's something to research. Abby Aldrich Rockefeller's sister Lucy was an inveterate traveler, both to Asia and to China and Japan. So she went a couple of times and actually was kidnapped in China. So that's a good story to read.
God. For Bill, and as a collections person, I love this question. How extensive are the archives at Penn related to Japanese architecture, and can the public access it?
Sure. The holdings we have related to architecture in Japan begin with the collection of Antonin and Noémi Raymond. So a fair amount of the material that I showed you this evening relates to our holdings that document the Raymond's time living and working in Japan, the letters they sent back and forth to each other and their family members. That 18 years before World War II, they also returned to Japan in 1950 and worked another 24 years in Japan. Architects in the collections, Liu Kahn was at the World Design Conference in 1960, so there's some fun material related to his lecture at Waseda University and visiting with the architect Kykuit. Bob Venturi and Denise Scott Brown did a wonderful resort hotel in Nikko, up in the mountains above Nikko. So there's actually quite a bit of material tucked in with the collections. Lawrence Halpern, the landscape architect, did work for the US consulate in one of the consulates in Japan. And because of Halpern, we've got a drawing by Kenzo Tange in our collection. But the archives are open. Usually when it's not COVID time, we have exhibition galleries so people are able to come in. Research by appointment. We just had we had some in-person research this fall on a restricted basis, but we had about 5 or 6 researchers. But that just ended given the city of Philadelphia closing down museums and libraries. So like Shofuso, our doors are closed now until hopefully not too long from now.
And Yukie, on that same note about collections, do you have the archives of the Japan Society construction and development at Japan Society, and are they open to the public?
Actually, no. We have some archive, of course, from the past renovation, but we don't have space to exhibit it. As the Cynthia said, all the collection of Rockefeller is in Asia Society. So the Rockefeller, the John D. Rockefeller is considered the Japan Society is more kind of a Kunsthalle. So we are showing something new and kind of new idea. So actually we don't have this space, but for this 50th anniversary, maybe it's a good idea. We can maybe do, and online could be one idea.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, having space for collections. You always want to find a nice collecting institution that can care for your archives and also make it accessible to the public. I know that we don't maintain any archives because we can't keep it accessible. And one question for Bill. What first brought the Raymonds to Japan? That's a great question.
Frank Lloyd Wright. They had worked for Frank Lloyd Wright in Wisconsin at Taliesin in 1916. Both Antonin and Noémi were contributing to the work there. And after World War I, the Raymonds had returned to living in New York City, and Frank Lloyd Wright recruited them to come work on the Imperial Hotel, which they did for about a year to 14 months. And then they recognized that there was an extraordinary opportunity for them to establish an independent practice. But then they also realized that there was an amazing moment happening in Japan. There was a lot to learn, and they were witness to, an incredible, they had an incredible experience in Japan, from the Great Kanto earthquake to rebuilding after that, to the friends they had, to that culture, in transition as it modernized. but we can blame it on Frank Lloyd Wright, but obviously the Raymonds took away a different sensibility of Japan than Frank Lloyd Wright. The knowing Japan through working and living there for the period of time, and when they did, I think distinguished their understanding or appreciation or sensibility of Japan from what Frank Lloyd Wright had.
Thanks, Bill. This is probably another one for you, Bill. This is a perfect Philadelphia one. Is there any known linkage between Quaker ethics of modesty and social justice and the traditional aesthetics of Japanese architecture, or should we understand it as primarily a connection of appreciation and influence of modernists?
That's a great question. I think the second part, yes. I mean, in a sense, the Raymonds, in choosing to come to New Hope, recognized the early Quaker farmhouse, and in the little Junzo's little scenes from the Raymond territory, you get a sense of that they saw a common ground between those two worlds, right? But they were looking at it as modernists. So I think that's essentially correct. I don't know if one goes back further, if those sorts of connections manifest themselves. One knows that at the Centennial Exposition in 1876 in Philadelphia, the Harper's Bazaar is showing, images of the construction of the two structures built by the Japanese for the Centennial Fair. And that energized a lot of people, and that the Japanese carpenters were there. And so I wonder if the Japanese carpenters were taken out to see anything of Philadelphia, and how that might have formed some sort of two-way street. But it's a great question, and something that I only touched on a little bit. So thank you.
Well, and actually in Philadelphia, we're going to be publishing a book about Philadelphia Quakers in Japan next year. There are close connections between Philadelphia educational institutions and the people that helped develop education in Japan during the Meiji period. So
I'll just add a quick addendum, Kim, if I may. I mean, there is an important connection, particularly during World War II, with the Philadelphia area and the Quaker community, from the point of view of being the one community that was vocal against the internment of Japanese Americans on the West Coast. And quite a few of the Quaker colleges in the area, Swarthmore, one in particular, were admitting students who had been placed in internment into the programs here in the Philadelphia region. And so it's I think very touching to know that George Nakashima and his family, wound up in Philadelphia, and some of his great clients in the Philadelphia area had been Japanese Americans in electrical engineering, for example, brought to Swarthmore, who then were working at RCA on color television. And, it was probably for the reason that the Quakers, were vocally resisting the oppression of the Japanese Americans. It's an important story that we should reflect on in the connection between Japan and the US in our region here in Philly.
Yes, thank you. Are there, and this is the last question, are there any other buildings by Junzo Yoshimura in the United States?
My favorite is the restaurant on the top of the mountain, which was this is a postcard. This was in Suffern, New York. It's been changed a bit, but I used to go there for my birthdays when I was in high school, growing up in northern New Jersey. That's an important example that still survives. I showed a few examples, but he had done a ticket office for Japan Airlines in Manhattan at Rockefeller Center, I believe, and also a Takashimaya in New York that neither I think exist. I'm working with my colleagues at the Brooklyn Museum to see if we can track down the tea house and what came of it, because it's no longer in their collection, and that sometimes happens, but I'm hoping we can track it down somewhere, and then we'll have another.
All right, and that was going to be the last question, but there's one quick question that I know Bill can answer. The question is, my colleague and mentor worked for the Raymonds in Tokyo after World War II. He was a Czech. I'm anxious to dive deeper. Any knowledge of the Czech lineage of the Raymonds?
Well, Antonin was born and raised outside of Prague and educated at the Czech Technical University. So he had strong connections to Czechoslovakia. In Tokyo, in the 20s, there was a Czech architect, Feuerstein, that worked in the Raymond office and contributed to the St. Luke's Hospital and other projects. And I think there were others. I think maybe this person is referring to Michael Chaya. I think he was Czech, who was one of the apprentices to work in the Raymond farm. He was there when Junzo Yoshimura was living and working on the Raymond farm. Michael Chaya did some of the construction drawings for the farm. So, but it's important. Yeah.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you to everyone. I'm sorry we're out of time for questions, and for those that asked questions that we couldn't get to, I apologize. But I appreciate you being here. So thank you to all the speakers. Now I'm going to throw it back to Ellie.
Thank you so much, Kim. Thank you to our wonderful panelists and to Kim for moderating, asking some great questions and engaging in some wonderful answers. And thank you again to our panelists for wonderful presentations. It's really been great to hear from all of you and to hear your shared connections and your experiences preserving these beautiful structures and landscapes. And thank you to our audience, and we hope you enjoyed the program. And I encourage you to visit the websites of Shofuso and Japan Society to learn more about them and all of their offerings during this time and beyond. And for more information on upcoming programs at the Pocantico Center, please visit our website at rbf.org/events. And we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you and have a great evening. Good night.
Good night. Thank you very much.
Thank you.